All right. Welcome, everybody. I am today's co-host or host or whatever the setup is, but talking to Jason Rheins. Jason, one of my favorite people, one of my favorite philosophers. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, my friend. How are you doing?
Outstanding. Although I keep agreeing to do these shows half an hour after I finish my workouts, and so like I'm kind of like jittery and brain fried. But thankfully, you have to do the heavy lifting today. I can just ask you a bunch of questions that have gathered up for me over the years, but particularly recently. One thing I've noticed is that very smart people who aren't like specifically interested in philosophy, but are interested in ideas, if they have kind of articulated views in epistemology, one of the most common like reference points is the ideas of Karl Popper, particularly for my friends who are more scientifically inclined. And I've never done a deep dive into his thinking and wanted to talk with you because I mean, some stuff strikes me as very wrong. Other stuff has struck me as um, there's something to it, but I don't know exactly how to fit it into my framework for thinking about things. Um, and I'd also like to circle back around to this issue of why his ideas are so attractive to a lot of really smart, thoughtful people. But maybe as a starting point, you know, Popper's most, I think, known for his this idea of falsification. So my kind of crude formulation of it is, well, look, we can't prove that any kind of universal theory is true. We can disprove theories. And so the goal is to come up with testable conjectures and then kind of see if we can knock them down. And if not, then for the time being, that's a good explanation. How would you kind of summarize the Popper's ideas? And maybe we can delve in deeper after that.
So that's a good, I think, basic description for falsificationism. Um, and there is a difference, I think, between falsificationism as Popper understood it and falsificationism as it's become popular and fashionable, particularly among scientists and the science literate and kind of STEM approving in the United States in particular and the UK also. In fact, I would almost go so far as to say there's what Popper originally developed the falsifiability criterion for, what its application is in the theory of positive science or falsificationism as Popper understood it, and then falsificationism as it's then sort of bastardized thereafter.
And so my understanding is that like he comes to it. So he had been a former Marxist. You know, he's writing at a time when like Freud and psychoanalysis is very big. And at least in some of his writing, it seems that this idea comes into being is we need to be able to draw a line between what's science and what's not. I think the demarcation problem is how it's often put. And so he's going to come down and say, look, if you can't falsify something by, you know, showing that it doesn't pass a test, then you can't call it science. And I mean, there's, to me, it doesn't seem like exactly the real problem. The problem is how do you justify knowledge in different realms? But at least from his perspective, it seems we need to be able to draw this line between science and non-science. And then he's going to, and that kind of becomes the entry point into this way of thinking.
That's right. That's right. So it starts as an answer to what we call the demarcation problem. What's science versus what's bad science or even what's pseudoscience? And psychoanalytic sort of theories about personality and personal development were one thing. Hegelian kind of and other German idealist theories of the 19th century, these rich, heavy theories about how every spirit works through the history of the world, and then Marxist historical sort of theories of dialectical materialism that say that all of sort of human history has been moving according to kind of material conditions for the means of production and its ownership, and then based on that, this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen next, and then this will happen next. Especially more than anything, whether it was the Hegelian version or the Marxist version, Popper really disliked historicism, which he defined as views that there are these general laws, scientific laws, but he thinks they're pseudoscientific laws governing human action and development such that you can predict what history is going to be. He thinks that every sort of, or that this kind of underlying thinking kind of drives many totalitarians and authoritarians. It justifies their kind of willingness to sacrifice any number of lives because they know what the outcome is going to be, and it's all heading there anyway. He even reads this kind of historicism into Plato. So I think he was right to think that Plato is the first like totalitarian political philosopher in the West. He's wrong to think that it comes out of historicism, and because he kind of gets that, because he kind of shoehorns Plato into it and does some weird things, his reading of Plato has been much criticized, but I think there's like a lot of insight into, in general, what he's saying. In any case, so historicism was the biggest target. Freudian explanations of things were other targets. And let me just give an example to people, right, who may not be familiar. So Marx and Engels start out by saying capitalism and industrialization is going to bring about this process where you have this huge surplus of goods in wealthy, industrialized capitalist nations, but the means of production will not be controlled by the workers, but by those who have capital. And then a particular poor class, not all the poor, not the agrarian poor, but the urban poor, the proletariat, the industrial workers who don't own the product of their labor, they will be in a position to organize together, seize the means of production, and bring about socialism. If you look at the Communist Manifesto, they start out by, or not they start, but much of the conversation is about past European versions of socialism that didn't work. And it's not that they didn't work because they got the socialism wrong. It's they just weren't the right historical moment where like the economic conditions were just right for this to take place. Okay, now jump ahead to 1917, the Bolsheviks and Lenin, right? Russia has never industrialized. Russia has never had capitalism. Russia has never become a rich country like England or the United States or even Germany, right? And yet the Bolsheviks are proposing, or Lenin is proposing, right, to bring about a kind of communist state. I mean, which just shouldn't happen, right? So then when they kind of do, and then they say, of course, this socialist state is going to work, right? They have to sort of change the story about how all this worked and how it would, not only how all this worked, but how it was all going to definitely work this way and always was going to be that way. And you change the story. And then Mao, right, in China, and now you have this agrarian society, right? And like, oh, now it's going to work in these other conditions, but and it always was. So you just keep changing the story. Or some Marxist comes and or semi-Marxist comes and they say the reason the American Constitution was written the way it was because of these specific economic incentives that the different framers of the Constitution had. You know, a bunch of them were invested in, these kinds of derivative markets and the Bank of England, and they were worried about this, and then the slave market was this other thing, and then that's why you get the system of government you want. And then, like maybe that makes sense for some of the economic motivations of some of these guys, but then you see like a bunch of them were arguing for things that totally went against like some of their economic interests or these particular things. And you go, well, what about this? And then instead of being like, oh, I guess you're right, I guess political ideology has its own strength apart from economic necessity. Maybe personality has a plan. Maybe the climate changing was a factor in human history. No, you just change the story. And so you never get this point where you just go, oh yeah, okay, the evidence matters, the observation matters, it's unfalsifiable. Now you mentioned that that you thought this didn't quite get to the fundamental, and I
well, I don't mean to interrupt you, but let me ask it this way. The same raising the same point I did before, but in a slightly different way. Is Popper arguing that basically there's only science and then there's untestable pseudoscience, or are there other kinds of knowledge that we justify? I guess he wouldn't like that word, but that are like supported in other kinds of ways?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think he thinks something like metaphysics is not science, because many of its claims are sort of not directly verifiable one way or another. So, for example, one kind of controversy over Popper is how he treated the theory of natural selection and Darwinian evolution, which he thought, he thought it was good. Well, he thought science was doing great with it. But people were like, how would you, is that really falsifiable or something like that? And he would say things like, it's inconceivable that science could be, biology could be where it's at without this theory. It's like, it's doing great job. It makes him kind of sound like a pragmatist. But there are times where he says, like, it's not like a direct experimental thesis. He says it's almost more of a metaphysical thesis. And then sometimes he says, like, it's almost close to a tautology. In other words, like, it's something like sort of logical and broad, that it's not quite the kind of science he means, where the science he means is like, is the particle here or not? Check the scope, right? Check the radar thing. Like, how many nanometers did it come out to be? Right. That's so there is, so it demarcates science from non-science. Not all of non-science is pseudoscience, but it's not the same as science, he thinks. And so there is metaphysics. And if the theory of if the theory of evolution is sort of metaphysics, then it's the good kind, and the Hegelian is the bad kind. What makes one good or the other bad? Then he starts to, at least on that particular issue, starts to sound a little sort of pragmatist about it allows other testable theories. So maybe a theory that allows falsifiable theories to flourish is what it takes. But none of it, I should say, is in a sense of valid induction knowledge. That is, all of this is provisional. Even science is provisional. So science has to have these theses that you can empirically test and falsify or not, but falsify or not. I don't mean that you can confirm them or validate.
Right.
Popper is a Humean, and he says we can't confirm general inductive theses. That we'll never see a necessity in it. All we can do is eliminate bad theories. And so in that sense, scientific knowledge is not confirmation. So I mentioned at the outset that the bastardized version of Popper sort of says we confirm by testing, and what survives testing is confirmed. And Popper is much clearer than that. Popper says, no, it's not. It's just survived, and it's rational to keep trying it and keep using it until it's falsified, but it is not confirmed. Not, like a million miles does not move you one iota closer to the goal line of an infinite journey. Right.
Which actually seems much more consistent with Hume.
Yeah.
And the idea that if you can't actually reach knowledge through induction, then to say like you've gotten closer to achieving knowledge through induction because it's been, quote, confirmed many times, that seems a little incoherent.
Yeah, right. So yeah, you couldn't get any closer to something you can never get closer to. But I will say Hume has something slightly more sane, sort of, at least as a psychological story. Hume says, okay, it's not rational knowledge, but we do trust the results of many observations, and that's habit, or and he has a lot to say about that. Habit or not tradition. It doesn't matter. But in any case, at least Hume has this kind of thing of like, yeah, we make an association. It's a non-rational association, but it's something there in the mind, right, that we rely on.
And Popper, I don't know that we want to go like this gets, I think, quite technical, but I mean, he really seems to want to strip out every kind of like psychological thing, including like even thinking of knowledge as something that's psychological. Like, I think he has some phrase about like knowledge without a knower. And I hear a lot of like scientists will even talk about knowledge as something like external to a mind, like living beings are knowledge kind of embedded in their DNA and things.
Yeah. Okay. So let me put a pin in that about Popper's third world. And we'll come to that in a second. I just wanted to add one further thing. I mentioned that the kind of bastardized version that that falsificationism is a way of confirming theories. Popper, is very clear this does not confirm theories. So the more popular version, oh, we're confirming theories, we're testing them, they keep surviving. Like, that's not how he put it. It's understandable why people have kind of watered it down in this way. But let me say that there is another problem with kind of a model of science as, so is Popper's own, you might say, is Popper's own theory of scientific practice, if it's a theory of confirmation or confirmation adjacent practices, if it's an empirical theory of what science does, not just normally, but empirical, is it falsifiable? And someone say, if it's falsifiable, it turns out it's false. And so people will look at the work of Kuhn, but also just the work of lots of historians and sociologists and philosophers of science, who just sit down and look at what scientists have always done and what they do now, or just talk to scientists or know some scientists or are scientists, and they'll tell you scientists, though, like, you'll win a Nobel Prize if you make an observation that violates general relativity, and that'll be really cool. Like 99.9999999% of the time, legit scientists, when they get data that doesn't fit with what general relativity predicts, assumes there's something wrong with their data, not general relativity. Scientists are not just out there being like, falsified.
Doesn't Popper kind of concede that? Like, I know in some places he says like, as a practical matter, you're not just going to get one fact and jump to the conclusion that your theory's out. In principle, if you knew for certain that this fact, contradicted your theory.
Right. Well, but then the question is, so what's the difference? What's the difference between you using auxiliary hypotheses to say, oh, this is just noise in my data, this was a dirty lens in my apparatus, this was a faulty assumption. What's the difference between that and the revisionist Marxists saying, oh, well, we didn't fully consider the role of imperialism in our model. And, I'm like, if you just take Marxism without bringing in the imperialism piece, or if you don't take into account this changing factor about the means of production, then you would get Marxist thing, but we've updated it, of course. This is scientific socialism. And so some Freudian saying, oh, but you didn't consider the other id adjacent principle of this, like, what's the difference, right? At that point, I mean, you might say, like, because one is reasonable as one is unreasonable, but then you're just saying science is reasonable and non-science is unreasonable. And that's not a great solution to the demarcation problem.
So we got thank you, Jonathan Honig, for the 199 super chat. We have Michael, there's 2 C's, so hopefully that is pronounced, Michael Sanders. So he asks a couple questions. I'll read one of them and then kind of put it in a wider context. If I drop a ball and it falls 100 times, how can I be 100% certain it will fall the 101st time? How many times do you have to verify a statement to be certain that it's true? So this is really asking, in effect, this is, I think, the version of induction, or one version of induction, that Hume and Popper would criticize, right? Is that you're just counting instances, and no, you couldn't know just because it happened 100 times. But Jason, maybe you can, just to give us a positive contrast, how do you think about induction and maybe some of the criticisms of it?
I mean, so in fairness to Hume doesn't quite put it in terms of the problem. Hume doesn't say, I'm addressing the problem of induction. Induction doesn't really come up certainly in the inquiry. I don't think it comes up in the treatise either.
Isn't he more talking about causality when
he talks about necessary connection and cause and effect? And what Hume is saying is that reason cannot determine or cannot perceive a necessary connection between cause and effect, where cause is an antecedent event and effect is the consequent event. You have impressions of one thing happening and then impressions of another thing happening, or you have one idea occurs to you and then another idea occurs to you. Impressions and ideas are what Hume is working with, not entities in the physical world. It's worth pointing out. But yes, like, when people take the Humean conclusion and apply it to the problem of confirmation or induction, the straw man is simple enumerative induction, right? I see 100 white swans, I say all swans are white, and then one black swan ruins the whole ruins the bunch of the inductive bunch, so to speak. Is it a gaggle of swans? Is it a grace of swans? I don't know. It's a lake of swans. So anyway, so so how do you think about it? Well, I mean, one way to think about it is rather than thinking of it as just a series of sort of instances of events, what a better way to kind of approach it is what is in effect, what is doing here? What are the things here, right? There's this object, it is falling, it is fall. What does falling mean? It is moving toward the ground or the earth or the earth center. And then the object, is it a unique thing? Is it just like this one bomb, or are we talking about what class are we talking about here? So are we talking, weighted objects with weight, and so on, or objects with weight without air resistance? Then you say, well, what happens if you put it in a vacuum? If you put it in a vacuum, a feather falls at exactly the same rate as a penny. And when you say they fall, right, do they just drop straight down? Do they drop faster if they are bigger or heavier? No, turns out they fall at the same rate regardless of their mass, or at least from the level of pre-super modern observation. And do they fall just at a constant rate? No, they accelerate as they fall. And then you start seeing, okay, all these things, they fall at this certain given rate as they accelerating as they do so. That can be described in a certain mathematical pattern. That's exactly the mathematical pattern that the orbits of the planets take around the sun. Isn't that curious? And then that's how you get to the Newtonian theory of gravity. Now, before that, long before that, people knew, I think for sure, that weighted objects would fall towards the ground when dropped, unless something else was holding them up or propelling them up. They knew that. It was arbitrary for them to think they would do anything different. And that's another issue involved here, not just how do you kind of know the generalization, but what is it that would oppose this, right? So in Humean metaphysics, there are these unattached ideas or impressions, like just, little pixels, as it were, on the screen of your mind. And one pixel in no way determines what the next pixel or even the pixel next to it is going to be. Think if your whole experience of the world, this is a little bit like Plato's allegory, became, instead of watching a cave wall, I'm showing you an old time slideshow with an overhead projector, next slide, this is us in Tacoma, this is us at the largest ball of twine, right? And so I'm showing you, like, here's an egg in my hand, and now here's my fingers going like this, and now like this, now like this, and here's the egg here, and here's the egg here, and here's the egg here, and with the floor, and here's the egg here, and here's the egg here, and then here's Zsa Gabor, or the cast of Green Acres, what made it necessary? Like, one slide doesn't make the next slide necessary. So Hume's kind of ontology is not of things, of impressions. And it's true, like, there's nothing that connects these impressions. But things which have a nature don't just do any old thing. They can't just suddenly, become a green hippopotamus or something like that. And it would be arbitrary to think that they could. And that's why, all these things, they fall towards the earth, but maybe one wouldn't. Well, I mean, I suppose if some extraordinary thing changed about them, maybe they could, but unless I have some reason to think that's the case, there's no reason to think they won't, because they're the kinds of things they've been. And if they're the kinds of things they've been, they'll do the kinds of things they've done. So in other words, Hume makes it this kind of meta principle that we can't confirm, that things will behave as they have in the past. And Hume says, what do you have to go on to base that? Well, in the past, things have happened like they had in the past. But you can only take that to mean that the future will be like the past if you can already take it that the future will be like the past. So
right.
You'd be begging the question. But the point is, that's not why you think that the future will be like the past, that the future will be like the past just because things are what they are and have a nature. And that's why they do what they do. So that principle, in objectivism, is the principle of identity and corollary of causality. That's why it's a presumption that the same thing in the same circumstances will do the same thing. And I mean, in the case of volition, it'll choose, but certainly the same physical object in the same circumstances will behave the same way. And so that part is not this weird hypothesis. That part is a kind of metaphysical ground. And then the other thing so let me just kind of commentary to simplify this long answer I began. The first part of my answer was, induction does not look like, for something like objects are falling, and they will fall, does not look like simple enumerative induction, 100 swans or Whitehall swans or what. What does it look like? It looks like what I was saying with how you get to the law of gravitation, in a very, very, very simplified way.
Right.
Second point, this kind of presumption of how would you know, and there's no necessity, comes out of a certain metaphysics that Hume has. It's a wrong metaphysics. On the right metaphysics, there's no reason to presume that similar things won't behave similarly in similar circumstances.
I wonder how much of, we mentioned sort of the negative contrast of what Popper was saying is pseudoscience, whether it's Marxism or Freudianism, or he talks about Adler. But he's also positively influenced by Einstein. And what you kind of sketched out as an example of induction, Newtonian physics, fits much more with how the empiricists, the best version of the empiricists you can imagine, follow, right? Like we observe, we kind of lead up to abstractions. I'm not an expert on Einstein, but at least it's much more plausible from what little I know that kind of what he did with relativity looks more like, I came up with this kind of creative conjecture, and now we're going to have these, tests to see if it will meet up to the standard. Do you think that's right? Or do you think maybe we view Einstein that way largely because we've been taught to throw out the, view of induction?
No. I mean, Einstein was brought up in and was broadly sympathetic with neo-Kantian approaches to science and to mathematical science. And he thinks very much in terms of his conceptual framework, kind of starting kind of presuppositions and kind of the mathematics and very basic concepts as a kind of framework in which you work things out. Throughout his career, especially early on, he makes tremendous work out of thought experiments. When he wrote his dissertation, people were like, "This is philosophy, not like physics," or "This is like high." It's either like math, either too mathy or too philosophical to just sort of be physics. And a lot of his inspiration for relativity came out of thinking about things like Poincaré's work in mathematics. And Hilbert. So I think it's the case that Einstein had his predictions. And then people like Eddington empirically confirmed it, like with the perihelion and Mercury. But the theory, some of it came out of just like thinking about sitting on a beam of light like it's on a train, and what would you observe, and what kind of paradoxes that would come up with if you struck to the classical Newtonian kind of picture, and or strict Euclidean space or whatever. So I think Einstein is broadly and correctly understood to be a kind of loosely, neo-Kantian, not Kantian or neo-Kantian every way, but broadly like a kind of, we have these conceptual frameworks, and the math is a framework, and space and time are kind of these frameworks for understanding things kind of way.
But I mean, isn't that what do you make of that? Because I mean, relativity, this seems like a kind of brilliant insight, and if it's approached in this really methodologically not what you would recommend somebody do, how do you think about sort of the kind of outcome of that versus the evaluating the process that led to it?
I do think it was methodologically well pursued. So I mean, Einstein said, when scientists self-describe their process, especially when you always have to take a grain of salt, but he said here he's being a bit self-deprecating, and he's like, I didn't reach better answers because I was smarter than everyone. I reached better answers because I stayed with the questions longer. I persisted with them longer. And I think, yes, he persisted with them longer, but other physicists spend their whole lives cracking their heads on the same thing. I would say, he stayed with the questions deeper. Like even in Einstein's sort of popular presentations of his ideas of like the theory of special relativity, or in his other physical talks, he is very, very philosophical in terms of like how he thinks about these things. How he's incredibly conceptual. Big surprise, a theoretical physicist. No, but I mean like at the abstract level. Like some of, like for example, like the things he says about the ether are like way clearer and more well thought out than like what everybody else sort of reacted to, and they're like, oh, Einstein's disproved ether. And he's like, wait a minute, what do you mean by that, right? If you mean that there is a medium through which sort of light passes, and there always is a medium, yes. If you mean that the medium has kinematic properties, no, it does not, right? And the Lorentz like kind of thing, that doesn't work. But if you mean like there's something, of course there's something. You couldn't make an observation if there were. So anyway, so my point is Einstein sat there and he thought, what would this mean? Like what does it actually mean to say that, we have two people were like, well, we make these synchronic or simultaneous synchronic observations. And Einstein's like, how do you know what simultaneity is? Like you would have to observe it, but how do you know, and he thinks through what simultaneity actually means in practice and observation. And so his concept of just the reference frame is just very deep. And I think like that's a great way for science to be done. I mean, you also have to be making observations, but the problem in Einstein's moment, like the problem wasn't that they didn't have interesting observations. They had black body radiation. They had the perihelion of Mercury. They had these observations they couldn't explain. And he just kind of thought deeper about some of the problems and about some of the new results and about some of the mathematics that they already had, like the Maxwell equations.
You mentioned it's part of that answer and in an earlier answer, Kant a few times. And let me know if this is off base, but I had the sense reading Popper, there was something similar to Kant in this respect, which is, with Kant, it's sort of like, how do we continue pursuing scientific and other kind of rational knowledge post Hume? And so how do we continue the enterprise like after this devastating attack? And Popper's almost like, how do we continue being scientific when Hume has taken away, our ability to what we thought we were doing, which was following observation? Do you think that there's something like that going on where he values the enterprise of science and is trying to rescue it at the price of saying that we can confirm our scientific knowledge?
Yeah. Both Kant and Popper would in good conscience to their own standards tell you that they are men of enlightenment, pro reason, they would tell you, and pro science. And they think science is this noble endeavor, and they want to see it continue. And they want to see the political conditions that will allow it to continue. And they will tell you certain things about, that Hume has said that make at least a certain kind of picture about how we would have knowledge problematic. But the kind of knowledge that I think Hume makes problematic, at least some of that knowledge Kant thinks we can have, but we can have it of phenomena, not phenomena. And Kant is an idealist, and Popper is not an idealist in that sense. Popper, I think to his credit, wants more of a kind of notion of a mind-independent world that we're finding out about, but he also has, in a sense, fewer idealist type resources to account for knowledge than Hume and than Kant, and is, in a sense, more flatly skeptical about empirical knowledge than Kant is. And by empirical knowledge, that's kind of a misnomer, because for Kant, nothing a posteriori is certain, but it can be in a framework of mathematical and physical laws and be pretty solid. to go to Popper now, maybe this is a good point, or it's no worse a point than I need to bring to lift that pin and mention the third world, because we've got his metaphysics on the
I was
table.
going to bring that up again too. So this, let's hear about it.
So, so Popper says, okay, like, look, at least since Descartes, whatever, we talk about one world, that's physical objects. And we talk about another thing, which is the mind, the inner world, subjective feelings, thoughts, that sort of thing. Where's knowledge? Well, in a sense, knowledge starts with, things that are in the second world, that are in the mind and are about, usually, in the first world. But scientists, other kinds of thinkers, do things to bring what is in the second world into the first world. They write books. They speak, they give lectures where sounds are coming out of their mouths and entering other people's ears. They have courses. They create stock examples that they give over and over again that their students teach to their students. The way Popper says it is like, it's like an animal leaving a path through the woods, right? Like, they create this thing, and this is what he calls the third world. And like the third world is expressions of things from the second world made manifest sort of in the first world, but it's not strictly reducible to just usual first world descriptions. So it's not like, yes, a book is a physical object. Yes, a lecture is a series of physical events, of sounds and warm bodies taking seats and so on, and someone pacing on a stage or whatever, or standing at a lectern. But it is also more than that. It is information that is conveyed. And so Popper's point is that knowledge isn't just something in the head. Knowledge is something in the world, insofar as it becomes this thing that exists, that is communicable and is sort of made manifest, and it can also be lost in that way. So it's not so intrinsic that, like, once we have a theory and knowledge out there in the world, it couldn't be lost. It could, right? Like if everyone forgets, or if a language goes so dead that no one can decipher what they wrote on the walls anymore, or something like that, that's gone to us. But as long as it sort of has the right links, it's there to be had and to be accessed. And that's, that's sort of Popper's third world. And then, other philosophers got into kind of, I think, more arguments, probably more than Popper himself worried about like, well, wait a minute, isn't the third world really just the first world? Or isn't it really just the second world? Like, is it really ontologically distinct? I could be wrong. Popper is not my specialty, but I don't think Popper was that worried about that part of the issue. I think he just wanted to talk about, like, the way in which knowledge isn't just something in the mind. And in a sense, he's right. I mean, knowledge is propagated not just at the end of the day, all the YouTube videos in the world being stored somewhere on a server that explain in the best, clearest terms some theory don't mean anything if there's nobody left alive who's watched them or will watch them or will understand them when they watch it. Like, it's in the third world, but it is gone. I don't know. There probably is an answer, and I don't know the answer to, like, does Popper consider that in the third world, or is it gone? I don't know.
Well, setting aside Popper, just when you're thinking about these things, because I mean, for me, any like knowledge, I mean, Ayn Rand defines knowledge as, it's your grasp of a fact of reality. It's a perspective on consciousness being in relationship to reality. A concept that I find more tricky, but that is used in kind of these contexts, is information. I mean, information seems to me, it's like potential data for a consciousness. Like, I don't have a real clear conception of it. And then there's these cases, like, so you'll have scientists talk about like DNA containing information and so on. And there seems to be something right about it, but also something conceptually messy about that. Do you have a kind of a worked out scheme for how you think about these things, however Popper might have thought about them?
Okay, let me take just information first and then related to Popper. So on information, I have like a take or two. I don't know that I have a worked out scheme. And part of my take is that it's information even is a kind of something of a concept of convenience. Like you might be able to kind of spell things out in terms of other things like knowledge and facts and so on. But it's a convenient concept to kind of talk about a bunch of those things sort of together without too much distinction. But I will say that in various fields of knowledge, the concept of information has become kind of corrupt. I still think there's a non-corrupt version of information, but as many scientists and philosophers use the concept of information, it has become a package deal between, on the one hand, those facts of reality which will affect other facts in a certain way and determine them to be a certain way, and thus inform them on the one hand, and said facts as potential material to be grasped for awareness by a consciousness. And those are not the same thing. So they'll sometimes talk about, how does the particle carry information to this other part of the system? And you're like, what do you mean carry information? What you mean is like, how does this affect that? Like, right. We know certain properties, at least mathematically, have a result on other certain properties. But physically, we may not understand how this value, as it is manifested in reality, affects and like gets to that value. And for convenience sake, somebody says, how does the information get there? But it's not information, it's just features. How does the effects get there? How does the right? Or information in the more Latin sense of like the thing that will stamp on that. How does it stamp? Or press itself. And then when you get to like things like information theory, where you're looking at like mathematical models of like just when you have different degrees of freedom and like how many variables can affect other variables and things like that, you're not talking about information in the sense of consciousness, but sometimes you absolutely are. And in general, it's pretty dangerous and maybe to kind of mix up those two, and it gets especially bad. It's not so bad when a physicist says like, how does the particle get the information over there? Okay, that but they also say things like the particle wants to go here, and they don't actually think that the particle has desires, right? It gets worse when then theorists of consciousness, some cognitive psychologists, some philosophers come back, and then they say, well, what consciousness is information processing, like your computer. And you go, wait a minute. Does my computer process information, or does my computer a bunch of electrical switches, basically? And yes, switches flip other switches, but it's not, processing. That's not a kind of cogitative process. That's just a physical process. Yes, my computer processes things the way one rock crushing a squirrel processes the squirrel, right? Like, okay, so that's now take Popper, and you might say like, so Jason, like, don't you think third world, doesn't it get into these same kind of dangers about like blurring the line between what's physical and what's conscious? And I think, well, I don't have that sense. I mean, I think maybe if I was in the heyday of debates about Popper's third world, which was before my time by a generation, maybe I would have that sense. But my sense tends to be like, look, all the time we talk about knowledge both as in the mind, and then knowledge is externally instantiated through books and lectures and through bodies of individuals. And in fact, it would be really inconvenient to not talk about it that way. Like science knows this, right? Like there's no person science, there's no mind science. So I tend to think the third world, at least some of this, at least the informal version of it, like scientists know or biology knows, doesn't bother me so much. So that's my kind of hot take and how I would relate it to the third world bit. I know that's not like a worked out theory.
No, but I mean, it's helpful. I mean, the thing that I find difficult, because I hadn't crystallized it the way you did, but that's sort of how I was thinking about how they were using information. The problem is trying to keep their use, like, all right, when I'm trying to learn something new, am I kind of accepting their use because it's in effect that informal way of describing like the way that, particles are moving about? Or is there something like misleading and wrong about this that's going to kind of distort my thinking down the road? And that's where I'll get confused about like, all right, is this more metaphorical, or is there real like something misleading about following this train of thought given that kind of use? And I haven't resolved that.
I mean, one way to do it, one way to approach that kind of question is to ask, when you say, forget how the cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind and the kind of consciousness is information processing, forget how they really abuse it. Just look at the kind of scientist who wants to talk about information, like how does the particle get the information here? How does the information conveyed, or how does the information from this DNA get expressed, right? And you ask yourself this question, like, what do I need? What do we need here? Like conceptually, what do we need? And you might say, well, what we need is a concept to express a set of facts of reality, not everything about reality, not the entity, but some set of facts. And fact is already kind of a term of convenience in metaphysics, a set of facts which are determinative for some other future set of facts and features in the world that we can sort of track. And we want to talk about those traceable determinative set of facts that will lead to other determined sets of facts, something like that. That's from the hip. And so you say, okay, cool. We need, that makes sense. We need a word for like patterns, or we need a word for like these facts that are going to make these facts, right? What can we call it? We could call it data, but data is already those things that are given, as in given to observation or consciousness. Information actually has less, at least etymologically, less obviously a conscious sense, though it is kind of informing us, and by now information means to us. I mean, maybe there's another word, or maybe we just say, okay, information, but we understand that like facts, a set of facts that are determinative for other sets of facts causally down the road is not the same thing. And those facts causing, physically affecting other facts is not the same thing as those facts getting in the mind and informing and giving knowledge to a mind.
Yeah, I mean, just as you were saying that, I realized that where this actually comes up as a problem is precisely when then there's an attempt to integrate the two different kinds of information, right? So I'm going to talk about information in the way of physics. So I've been reading David Deutsch recently, and he often does this. And it's hard to tell, is this a legitimate integration, or is it based on this kind of package deal of a concept like information? I think at least just being aware of that issue is super helpful. So we only have go ahead, and then we have some super chats I want to get to.
We are beings of flesh and mind. It is, and the first kind of causation that we're aware of is the causation that we create on the world by what we want to do and think about doing, then doing it. It is impossible for humans to not sometimes put our kind of human conscious sort of spin on non-conscious world. And indeed, it's an achievement to realize that the natural world by and large does not work the way an intentional conscious animal does. And so with things like the pathetic fallacy of kind of like personalizing non-living things or even non-human animals, right, will always be with us. It can be harmless. It can even be harmless as just metaphors in physical theories. But you're exactly right that it's when you take this metaphor that physicists say are using, the metaphor of us being informed as a way of talking about these facts causally influencing these other facts and giving them their determination. It's when you take that metaphor and then turn it back over to a theory of consciousness, and then you see no difference anymore between consciousness and dominoes falling. Then there's the problem, right? Just as you said.
That's great. Yeah, not just as I said, but more eloquent. So Roland, thank you for the $1.99, or I guess that's £1.99. We have a question from Atlas Spoke. Thank you for the $5. It says, please consider David Harriman's comments on Popper and the logical leap. And then he quotes them, quote, by demanding that a true generalization must apply with unlimited precision to an unlimited domain, Popper upheld a mystical view of truth, ... that is forever outside the reach of man and accessible only to an omniscient God. Any thought? I mean, we don't know the context. You might not remember the context that Herman was saying this.
I will say this, that if the standard for making an inductive generalization is that we have omniscience, that we know that we be able to foresee every possibility, then yeah, it would be impossible. And I think we have to be what is technically called fallibilists about knowledge, including knowledge by induction in most cases. What do I mean? So that means we have knowledge, but we could be wrong about it. And it doesn't mean we're wrong to call it knowledge. Just because there are cases that we think are knowledge and turn out to be wrong, doesn't mean there are no cases of knowledge where they really are knowledge. And we shouldn't act like they're knowledge. We have every reason to think that. And even when it turns out that there's something that was totally unforeseeable, we then integrate that into our body of knowledge. We incorporate it into what we thought in the first place. Whatever led us to that conclusion in the first place was not, if it's reasonable to have thought it was knowledge, was not arbitrary. It was a body of facts and observations too. So it grows. So yes, it is to have a standard for knowledge of omniscience does defeat knowledge. And in that sense, skeptics sort of start out with a kind of mystical standard, and then they feel like, well, we'll never hit it. And then they're disappointed mystics in a way. As Rand puts it in one part of ITOE. So that part at least I agree with. I don't know that that's all that's driving Popper, but I mean, I guess that's some of that's there. I mean, insofar as induction can't be deduction. There's a bit of that in Hume too. Induction can't be deduction, so nuts to induction. That's not right.
Well, Jason, I found this really insightful. Well, we do have a couple more minutes, so maybe we can come back to my original question if you just want to say a few words about why you think that Popper does resonate, particularly for better people who are kind of interested in epistemology. Like, what is it about him that is appealing, or maybe what is it about a lack of good alternatives that's depressing?
Yeah, I mean, Popper. Look, Popper was this Austrian and then British relocated philosopher, better than other members of the Vienna Circle, certainly better than Wittgenstein and others sort of around him, however philosophically flawed he was. Popper has, I think, for all the problems that are in his theory, and they are very, very deep and at a very kind of fundamental level of his metaphysics and epistemology, from my perspective, at least sort of spiritually, he wants to be on the side of the Enlightenment. He is anti-totalitarian. He wants a society that is open to reason and to people thinking things out and making choices and the flowering of the human mind. He knows that that force and control sort of are enemies of this. He isn't slavishly tied to the left, as many other kind of intellectuals of his era sort of are. I think he loves science and he thinks it's great, and for good sort of reasons. But in some ways, you could say that Popper is sort of writ large some of what you might say were the problems of the original sort of European Enlightenment, namely that it was committed to the right things, freeing the human mind from force and control, and using science as a model for other domains of human pursuit. But if you look at the kind of real deep philosophical foundations of it, so how do you think knowledge works in reality? oh, that's a mess, right? Oh, that's never going to work.
Yeah.
And if you pursue that, it's going to be a disaster. So I think that's the that's the tragedy in a way of Popper. I think his heart was in the right place, is to the extent that I understand it, at least in sort of his broad kind of commitments to public reason, intellectual and political freedom in a very broad sense, and at least in wanting to be pro science, but at the same time having a theory that completely demolishes the very concept of science. If we can't acquire knowledge, what the heck is science? And trying to redefine it as as the storytelling where we throw out certain stories when they don't work is like, that doesn't work.
Well, Jason, this was amazing. It was so much fun to talk to you. Coming up on today, we have at 7 p.m. UK time, 2 p.m. Eastern, Hard Money Jim with Jim Brown, Inflation, It's Everywhere. At 8 p.m., we have Jim Valiant's discussing Leonard Peikoff's Reason, Emotion, and the Arbitrary. And at 10 p.m., we have TV Talk with Mark Pellegrino, Jennifer Buoni, and Jax Schumann. So thanks, everybody. Thanks especially to our super chatters. And Jason, hopefully we'll get to do this again sometime.
I would love it. Thank you. And let me just say, this interview, you had like the Terry Gross problem. Like you came in and you knew so much that I was like, well, how the heck how am I, you've done his homework too well. What am I going to say?
All right. Well, that compliment made my day. So thanks again, everybody. And we will talk soon.